This is the second lecture for Monday, April 13th. We're looking at the deep sea as one of these marine ecosystems that we're surveying in our class. And we recognized two different features of the deep sea. One, it's very extensive in the ocean. A huge part of the ocean could qualify as the deep sea. Now, there's no border when you're going down. When you come across this, it says now you're entering the deep sea. Different places you might encounter environmental conditions that would start to be called the deep sea, but eventually you get to this part of the ocean that is the other point, that it has these conditions that organisms have to deal with. Organisms have to be adapted to, or they're just not going to survive. So we looked at cold and high pressure and saw that those are very similar in a lot of ways. Very cold water affects organisms in a similar way as very high pressure water does. And we looked at some of the adaptations that organisms have in terms of their enzymes and the cell membranes, the phospholipids they have in their cell membranes. And now we're going to look at this other characteristic of the deep sea, is that it's dark. One of the mechanisms that a lot of organisms have in terms of living in this area where there's no light from above, which is different than most of the ocean, is that there's a lot of bioluminescence. So we looked at this already in one of those sections of the open ocean. We were looking at mesopelagic and the prominence of bioluminescence in those organisms. There's a lot of bioluminescence there. Well, if you move into the deep sea, there's a lot of organisms that aren't bioluminescent in the deep sea, but it's also fairly common. And they use bioluminescence for the same thing, for communication amongst species, for prey capture, predator avoidance. Some of the main mechanisms, the main reasons why bioluminescence is advantageous in the deep sea. There's no light there. Well, another thing that's quite characteristic of deep sea organisms is their eyes. Some organisms in the deep sea, or even in the getting down into the deep sea, but not quite into the deep sea, they have very big eyes. And then the physiology of their eyes, the way that they work and the biochemistry of their eyes is different than shallow water organisms. So let's look at some of those. It's one of the main things. If you looked at the eyes of a deep sea organism and compared it to the eyes of a shallow water organism, these are some of the differences that you might find. Certainly not in everything. There's exceptions to this, but for the most part, the eyes of deep sea organisms tend to be larger. If you just look at how big their eyes are in proportion to how big their body is, these deep sea organisms tend to have bigger eyes. There's a lot of deep sea organisms that have eyes, not just fish, but crustaceans, cephalopods as well. And so if you've got bigger eyes, then you're a lot more sensitive to light. And then another characteristic is if you look in their retina, there's rods and cones. Most of you are familiar with this idea that you've got these two photoreceptors in the eyes of vertebrates and even invertebrates that have eyes like this, that there's two different types of photoreceptors that have different sensitivities. And rods are especially sensitive to light as opposed to acuity, focusing things, and colors. That's what cones do. Cones are associated with being able to focus and being able to differentiate shapes very characteristically and also seeing colors. But rods are sensitive to light, and if you look at the proportion of rods versus cones, that some of these deep sea organisms, they don't have any cones. They don't need cones. And so what you find is that they've got all these rods, these rod-shaped photoreceptors in their retina at the back of their eye that light hits on. And so they're very sensitive to even tiny little levels of light. And that there's a lot more rods, and that they're in layers as opposed to just one layer. You could have 6 layers of rods versus 1 layer, sometimes 2 layers in shallow water organisms. And there's a lot more rods, and they're all packed together. So the point is, whatever tiny little light there is in the deep sea, and again, it's generated by animals through bioluminescence, but whatever that tiny little bit of light there is, then the eyes of these deep sea organisms tend to be much more sensitive to that light, even if it's an extremely low level, than shallow water organisms. So you can see here in terms of sensitivity of light, because of how big their eyes are, and 2, because of the rods, the distribution of rods and the number of rods and the orientation of rods, that they can detect light levels as high as 100 times lower, as great as 100 times lower than humans. So our eyes, they're not particularly sensitive to low light levels. We rely on our cones a lot. But these deep sea organisms can see light 100 times better than our eyes are capable of. That's pretty sensitive to low light levels. Well, let's look at these 2 other things. The pigments that are found in the retina, and that in this structure in the back of the eyes, that's called the tapetum lucidum. In the human eye, in the eye of fish, in the eye of squid even, if you look at this figure down at the bottom, that's basically what an eye looks like, the vertebrate eye. And the squid eye is very common, very similar, but there's the pupil, there's this opening that light passes through, there's a lens that changes shape and focuses light on the back of the eye on this layer of cells called the retina. And then in the retina, there's all these different photoreceptors that are excited by light of certain wavelengths. And when those cells, those photoreceptors, are excited by light of a certain wavelength, those cells are depolarized and they send a nerve impulse to the brain. And then the organism, interprets these different sensory impulses as colors or shapes, some kind of sensory information that's based on light. So that's how it works. This light passes through the retina, and in the retina, there's these different types of photoreceptors. There's rods and cones. So if you look in this diagram, where all those cells are to the far right of this eye, you can see there's these different cones that are colored. There's red, and there's green, and there's blue. So there's these 3 different types of cones that detect colors, basically light of certain wavelength that we interpret as a color. So there's blue light, and there's green light, and there's red light. And you can mix those 3 colors together to get all kinds of different colors. So we can see purple, we can see magenta, we can see cyan, all these different versions. We can see pink, but those are basically mixtures of those colors. So those are cones. They're cone-shaped. You can see in this diagram they look more like cones. And then there's all these rods, these long skinny ones that are in between the cones. Those are the ones that are especially sensitive to light. So this is a typical shallow water type of organism, or terrestrial organism. Could be a human with 1 layer of photoreceptors, 1 layer of rods mixed in with cones. So the eye of a deep sea organism would look very different. There'd be these rods all very tightly packed together, and then you'd have multiple layers of those rods so that whatever light was there, you'd be able to detect. Well, the other thing is that the wavelengths of light that depolarize the rods and the cones, they're different for shallow water organisms and deep sea organisms, as you might expect. If you're up close to the surface, you're exposed to light of different wavelengths, light of different colors, and we see different colors. And you move down into the water column, then that light starts to be attenuated, and you get down, it's not even very deep, but you get down to a certain point where the only light is blue light. We looked at that before. If you're in the deep sea, you might be wondering why you would even have photoreceptors, why your eyes would be sensitive to light of any kind of wavelength other than what's being created by bioluminescence. This bioluminescent light tends to be blue, and it tends to be a certain wavelength. Light on the surface, light in air on land, tends to be at higher wavelengths, different colors. And in fact, if you look at the sensitivity of the retina, the photoreceptors in the retina of deep sea fish, deep sea squid versus shallow water organisms, then you see that very thing, indeed, that their eyes contain photoreceptors that are sensitive to wavelengths of light that are lower, associated with blue light, that has a wavelength of about 480 nanometers. That's the wavelength of light that if it hits your eye and is focused on your retina by your lens, then how you perceive that is as blue light. Wavelength of light that's higher, 500, 520 nanometers, we interpret those as different color light. Green light, yellow light, red light. And so this bioluminescent light tends to be at a wavelength of about 480 nanometers. That's what you see. And so if you took out of the retina, you could take an eyeball from a fish and not even have the live fish, but look at the retina and these photoreceptors in the retina and see, you can determine experimentally the sensitivity of those photoreceptors to different wavelengths of light. What you'd find is a retina from a deep sea fish is sensitive to these lower wavelength light, which corresponds to blue light, which is what bioluminescence is. Now, another thing about these deep sea organisms in terms of their eyes is that they have this structure in the back of the retina called the tapetum lucidum. It's this layer of guanine that's reflective. It's like a mirror in a way. Now, we're familiar with this in the eye shine that we see of nocturnal animals on land, deer and alligators and possums and cats. Shine a light on their eyes, then it shines. It reflects that light. Now, I was on a cruise one time and I had all these deep sea sharks, and I'm not always that good of a photographer, but I took a picture of all these sharks lined up on this table, and the flash didn't go off. And so I show people this picture now, and I say I did this on purpose to show that their eye shine, but these are deep sea sharks with this tapetum lucidum. It shows what you see, same thing with the raccoons or alligators at night out in the Florida Everglades. You can see their lights, their eyes all lit up like this, or your cat. But how this works is that behind the retina, behind all those photoreceptors, the rods and cones, there's this layer of guanine called the tapetum lucidum. And in these terrestrial organisms like cats and raccoons and alligators, those kind of things, there's these little shutters that can open and close. So at night they're open so that light passes through the shutters and hits against the tapetum lucidum. What that does is it reflects the light back through those photoreceptors, back through those rods. So the light comes through once. You can see in this diagram, the drawing up on the right, where the tapetum lucidum are those little shutter-like things at an angle. And you can see in that top part of that figure, where it says tapetum, that's circled, the light is passing through those photoreceptors, and then it's being reflected by the tapetum lucidum back through the photoreceptors. So you've got two chances of detecting whatever little low light levels there are, because the light is reflected back through their eyes by the tapetum lucidum. Then these shutters close, and so the tapetum lucidum isn't functioning. And if you look at the figure below that, where there's no reflection, then the light just passes through the rods and the cones through those photoreceptors once. It's not reflected. That's how our eyes work. So you've got one chance to detect whatever light there is, one chance for your photoreceptors to be excited by wavelengths of light of certain wavelengths. So in shallow water organisms that can see well at night, nocturnal organisms, and terrestrial organisms that have this tapetum lucidum, these shutters open and close. They're closed in the daytime because you don't need all this extra light, and they're open at night to reflect whatever little light there is and use your photoreceptors twice, basically. Have light pass through the photoreceptors twice. In the deep sea, they don't even bother with these shutters. They're open all the time. There's no daytime in the deep sea. So it's another adaptation they find in the eyes of deep sea fish, deep sea organisms, squid, crustaceans, that also greatly increases their ability to see whatever little light there is. So you see, in terms of their eyes, there's a number of different adaptations that deep sea organisms have. It's dark, but there is light. There's a lot of bioluminescence that goes on there, and there's a big advantage for being able to see that, for predator avoidance, for capturing prey, for communication amongst the different species. And the last thing that we have to look at is low biomass. It's a characteristic of the deep sea as well. We'll save that for Wednesday, and then also look at hydrothermal vents.